This is the video instructions for my pamphlet kit, which makes 4 hardcover pamphlet books. For details on how to buy this kit and for the written instructions, please see the description below. The pamphlet is a single section book which was traditionally used as a starting point for teaching bookbinding, especially in schools, and this design is based on books such as Simple Bookbinding for Junior Schools by William Matthews or the Douglas Cockrell equivalent. There's another video on the Daz Bookbinding YouTube channel that goes into more depth about the history of this binding structure. To use this kit, you need some basic tools such as scissors, a bone folder, an awl, a steel ruler, and a craft knife. Now, if you don't have an awl, you can use the sewing needle that comes with the kit and a cork as the handle. And if you don't have a bone folder, anything that's smooth and hard, such as maybe the handle of a butter knife, can be used. You'll need a piece of corrugated cardboard, which is used to stab through the paper into with the awl, and something to cut on. The kit includes all the materials that you need for the 4 books. All the materials are cut in the correct grain direction. If you don't know about grain direction in materials, then I highly recommend you watch the video I have about grain direction, because that's very important in bookbinding. The patterns and colours of the materials, such as the board papers and spine cloth, does vary from kit to kit, and I'm very sorry that I can't provide custom orders for colours and patterns. However, if you do have favourite papers, you can substitute those for what's included in the kit. There's some linen thread, some scrim to reinforce the spine, a sewing needle, that's a genuine bookbinder's sewing needle, the strips of paper are used for measuring. There's written instructions and there's a PDF available in the description below. The blank paper is used to attach the boards. The coloured paper is the paste down and first free end paper, and then the lined paper is for the text block. The steps in making the book are fold the paper, sew the section, attach the cover boards, cover the spine and boards, and then paste down the end papers. We'll start by folding the paper for the books. So there's 8 sheets per section and 1 section per book. So I'll count out 8 sheets of paper and fold that into a section, often called a signature, especially in America. An 8-sheet section has 16 leaves and 32 pages, a page being either side of a leaf. A signature is also a mark by the printer on the first page of a section to let the binder know where the sections start and the order of the sections. It's normally the letters of the alphabet, with some of the letters omitted. Thick books, once the alphabet's used up, then they double up. So AA, BB, etc. Now each book gets 2 sheets of coloured paper for the end papers and an outside white sheet which is used to attach the boards. The colour of the end paper sheets will vary from kit to kit, but there'll be an even number, and it's probably best to keep the 2 the same colour. The white sheet goes on the outside. Because these sheets will wrap around the text block, it's best not to bone fold this really sharp like I just did there without thinking, so then I opened it up to round it out again. Now, using some clothes pegs or paper clips, put them together and mark the inside of the book. This will make sewing easier. Pamphlet sewing is an easy and fun way to sew single sections. It's always done with an odd number of holes, with a minimum of 3 holes, and we're going to do it with 5 holes. So start by doing the center hole, a hole either end about a 10 millimeters or a half an inch from the end of the book, and then a hole halfway between these holes. It doesn't have to be exact. You can just eyeball it and get it close to those locations. Pushing the awl through the fold at 45 degrees will get it very close to the outside of the fold, and if it's slightly off, that's fine. You'll never notice it. There's a number of minor variations in how pamphlet sewing is done, and with 4 books to do, we get to explore these. But we'll start with the 2 most common approaches. You'll notice that the book cloth and board papers are odd shapes or different sizes, and that's because the starting material varies in size. And rather than waste material, I make it as large as possible so you get the offcuts, which you might be able to use in other projects. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have an awl, you can use the needle that comes with the kit and a cork, and that works as a fairly effective awl. The kit comes with more than enough linen thread to do the 4 books. So start by cutting the thread into 4 equal lengths. The linen thread is either 25 3-ply or 18 3-ply, which are both very similar threads. After threading the needle, bookbinders have a little trick to stop the needle pulling off the thread. They pierce the end of the thread with the needle and then pull this pierced piece of thread down over the needle and back onto the main piece of thread. You don't have to do this, but it's a good little trick to know. We'll start with what I consider to be the classic form of the pamphlet sewing, which has the knot on the inside of the section. So we start in the center hole and then alternate to the end of the book, leaving a few inches of tail of thread at the center, and then we start to alternate back towards the center. However, when we reach the center, we skip the center hole. Working towards the other end of the book, do the same thing, alternating back and forth through the holes. If you have trouble getting the needle through the hole from the back, just open it up a little bit from the inside of the fold. And once we reach the center hole, we'll come back from the outside, and we want 1 thread either side of the thread that goes from head to tail. And then we'll tie a square knot or a reef knot over the top of the thread, which will secure it in the section. The 5 holes and the continuous line of thread on the inside and outside of the section or book provides a really secure attachment for the leaves of the book. The only problem is it does have that knot on the inside. So the second version we'll do is we start on the outside, and it's exactly the same otherwise. And this means the knot will be on the outside, so there won't be a knot on the inside of the book. The only issue with this is if the knot's too bulky, you may be able to see it through the cover material on the spine. However, I do like this method because you don't see that knot, and it doesn't have the lump of the knot that can be a bit bulky. With the finer thread, it's not too bad. But it's nice to not be able to see the knot as long as you can't see it through the spine covering material. If you were making a larger version of this book, then you could increase the number of holes. Maybe you could go to 7 holes. Or a smaller version, or even with this size, you could do it with 3 holes. 3 holes is the minimum, and you can have pretty much as many holes as you like, though obviously you don't want the holes too close together, but it always has to be an odd number of holes. This third variation I think is a little unusual because I don't think it's the classic pamphlet sewing technique, because you go back through the center hole. I'm not a big fan of this technique, but because it is in Mr. Matthews' book, I did want to demonstrate it. So once you get back to the center for the final time, you tie a knot, you hook around the external thread from the other direction and tie a square knot. It's a bit hard to tie this knot tight, and that's one of the main reasons I don't like this technique. But it is shown in some classic textbooks, so I did want to demonstrate it to you so you're aware of it. So I think that covers most of the variations, so that for this final book I'm going to do what I think is my favourite, which is the classic, where you skip the centre hole on the return and tie the knot on the outside. For your fourth variation, you should pick the one that you think is your favourite and repeat that version. The next step is to reinforce the spine with a loosely woven cotton material that I know as scrim. So we'll cut it into 4 equal width pieces. It doesn't have to be precise. This material is also known as mull or crash or super, depending on where you come from. The width isn't super important. After about 10 millimeters or a half an inch, extra material doesn't really add much strength. So there's a sort of a minimum width of 10 millimeters, half an inch. Another material I forgot that you'll need is PVA glue. It's the only glue we'll use in the project. Any PVA designed for paper is perfect. I wouldn't use a PVA that's designed for wood. If you don't have PVA, then any of the paste type glues will work as well. They'll just take longer to dry. You can make a paste out of laundry starch. You can even make paste out of wheat flour or rice flour. After gluing the spine, you can put them on the edge of the bench with the spine overhanging so that the spine doesn't glue itself to the bench, where I'm using a piece of wood to simulate the edge of the bench. Once the spines have dried, the next step that I'm going to do is to trim the 3 edges of the books. Now you don't have to do this step, this is an optional step. But what I like about it is that if I trim the books all to exactly the same size, then I can trim all the subsequent materials to exactly the same size, and it reduces the amount of measuring I have to do. So I'm going to trim just enough material off the head and tail and foredge so there's a nice clean edge. After I've trimmed the first book, I'll trim all the subsequent books to the same size as the first. I'll do all the heads and tails first, and then I'll do all the foredges together. To help with trimming the book, you want a really sharp blade. So these snap-off blades are great. So you can just snap the end of the blade off with a pair of pliers so you've got a fresh, sharp edge. Keep your hand vertical so that the knife doesn't veer away from the ruler, and use multiple light cuts rather than trying to cut it with one heavy cut. Now that I've trimmed one end of the second book, I'll use the first book to measure the height, and I'll do the same thing for the subsequent books. I'm using a bench hook with a cutting mat to help with this trimming, but you don't need one of these bench hooks. You just need something straight to push up against. So you could have a table up against a wall. You could clamp a piece of wood to your bench. You do need something to cut on. You don't want to cut into your table. So that could be a piece of thick cardboard. But these bench hooks with a cutting mat are great to work with, and they're fairly easy to make, and I've got a video that shows how to make them. At the same time as trimming the foredge, we'll put a line 6mm away from the spine, which will be the attachment line for the cover boards. So just put a mark at the head and tail, 6mm in from the spine, and draw a line between the two. Now we'll mark the width of the book, which is about 10 centimeters. So that you want to make it as wide as possible, but to clean up the foredge. Now, I think 10 centimeters is probably the right number, but if you can get an extra couple of millimeters, that doesn't hurt. Use your knife to make the marks. It's much more accurate than using a pencil. And then trim the foredge. Again, 6mm line in from the spine on the next book, and then the same 10 centimeters to the foredge, and repeat for all 4 books. Once all 4 books have been trimmed, then flip them over and mark the 6mm line on the other side as well. Now all the blocks have been cut to the same size. We'll measure the size that the boards need to be. So we'll measure the length of the book, and then we'll add 2 times 3mm to get the height of the boards. The boards or the covers will overhang the text or the block by 3mm at the head and the tail. So that's the extra 6mm. And for the width, it goes from the 6mm line to 3mm past the foredge. So it was 94mm from the line to the foredge plus 3 to get 97. So now we need to cut 8 pieces of board that dimension. We'll start by making sure the edge is straight by just taking it off a couple of millimeters. And then we'll cut the board to the correct height, which was 151mm. Again, I'm using my knife to mark the measurements because it's a lot more accurate than a pencil. And then once I've got one board to size, I'll use that to measure the other boards. So we'll end up with 4 boards, one for each book, which we'll then cut the 2 cover boards out of. Now we'll cut the boards to the correct width. We'll start by squaring one end using a plastic square and the steel ruler. And then from the square end, we'll cut the width, which was 97mm. And then we'll do that 7 more times so that we've got 8 boards all the same size. Now it's time to attach the boards to the books. The boards attach from the 6mm line with an even square. The square is the overhang around the edge of the book. So there should be an even 3mm overhang or square around the book. Start by doing a few practice runs. What we'll do is we'll glue out the outer piece of paper and then lay the board down on the book. Now you want to position it on the pencil line. So you drop the board down on the pencil line and then roll it down onto the book. And if you get that front edge right on the line and the head and tail even, 3mm overhang, then it'll be perfectly positioned. We'll use the PVA again And if you put a bit of glue past the line, that's fine. That's just reinforcing the joint. So you don't need to mask it off. Just make sure the glue at least reaches the line. And now, as we practiced, carefully put the board down on the line and then roll it down onto the book. And now repeat that 7 more times. If you are worried about wrinkles in the paper, then open the book up on the edge of the bench with the spine hanging over the edge of the bench. That way when you lift it up, it doesn't force the paper away from the board. You can use your hand or a bone folder to smooth out any wrinkles. Just be a bit careful because the paper is wet and prone to tear. Once you've glued on the front and back boards, then stand the book up on its head or tail with it a bit open to allow the glue to dry. The covering style is called a quarter binding. That means the book cloth that covers the spine extends about a quarter of the way onto the book. So we need to mark up the book for the covering material on the spine. Now the board paper, the decorative paper, will overlap the cloth by 3 millimeters. So we measure the width of the book from spine to foredge, divide by 4 and then add 3, and then it doesn't hurt to just round it up. So it got us 30 millimeters. So I'll measure in 30 millimeters at the head and the tail, and that's 30 millimeters from the very outside edge of the spine. So that's how far the cloth is going to extend onto the boards. Now you can go around and use a pencil and ruler to measure that on each of the books, or if you've got a pair of spring dividers, you can use that as well, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. Now we need to measure how large to make the piece of cloth to cover the spine. So we start by measuring the height of the boards, and then we'll add 25 millimeters to that. That'll give us enough material for the head and the tail turn ends. And then we'll use a scrap piece of paper that's in the kit to wrap around the book to work out how wide to cut it. Wrap the piece of paper around the book, marking the front line, pinching the paper down into the spine grooves, and then marking the other side line. And from that you can measure the width of cloth that needs to be cut. So now we have the height and the width. So we'll cut 4 pieces of cloth to these dimensions. Now it's important that the width is exact, but the length can be a little bit out, which just means I don't have to use the bench hook to cut the ends exactly square, which just speeds up the process a little bit. Now the kit comes with 5 pieces of cloth so that you've got a bit of a choice in colours. So you might want to either cut all 5 pieces to this size, or try and match up the colours of cloth with the colours of the board papers that you have, and then you can keep the 5th piece of cloth for another project. Now we'll do an operation that's called slitting the joints. So we're going to cut down on the piece of paper that attaches the covers to the book, and we'll cut those down to about the height of the top hole in the sewing, and we'll lift that up and then just cut that off. Now you just have to be careful not to cut the sewing thread, and this just allows us to turn the covering cloth for the spine over the boards and down into the hollow spine. This will make sense in a moment. The main thing to remember is don't cut the sewing thread. So before we put glue on the cloth, it's a good idea to use a scrap piece of cloth and just practice turning in the material over the spine. So what we'll do is we'll open the book up and then fold the cloth over at the head and tail and fold it down into the spine like that. So just practice doing that a few times. What you do is you open up the boards and hold the section or signature up vertically. So make sure that you slit the joints on all 4 books. You don't have to cut that piece of paper out. You should be able to just rip it out depending on how far the scrim or mull extends up the spine. Now it's time to cover the spine, so take a piece of cloth and glue it out with PVA. Then we'll pitch that to one of the lines on front or back, doesn't matter where you start, and as you start to wrap it around the book, you want to rub it down on the edge of the board into what's called the groove. It's not really a groove on this book, but we'll call it the joint instead. So rub it down on one side, and then maybe using the pointy end of your bone folder or maybe the blunt end of a pencil, you can push the cloth down into that, what we call it, joint or groove. And then once it's down up against the edge of that board, wrap it around the spine, and again, using the bone folder or whatever, or your thumbnail actually, push that down into the groove, up against the edge of the board, and then finally onto the board. Now if it goes over or is a bit short of the line, then that's fine. It's going to get covered by the board paper anyway, so it won't be noticed. Now the next tricky part is to turn in the head and tail. So as you practice, just turn it in, use your bone folder or a paddle pop stick, works really well to flatten out the cloth at the spine. If you've been a bit slow like I have here, then you can freshen up the glue. And once you've done that 3 more times, then you've completed the most difficult step in the project. Now we're approaching the end of the project. We'll cover the boards with the decorative paper. So we have to mark where we're going to place the paper towards the spine. So we want about a 3mm overlap of the paper and the cloth. So you can measure all around the book and work out what the shortest measurement is, and then add 3mm to that. And once you work out that distance, you can measure that all around the book. And just put a little prick mark with your awl that distance in from the foredge. Even if the overlap is a little bit different on the front and back, you want the paper to extend the same amount. And that will hide that slight difference in the front and back. Now we need to measure how large to cut the decorative paper. So the turn-ins, the amount that will turn in over the head and tail and at the foredge, is 15mm. So we measure from the prick mark to the foredge, from head to tail, and then add 15 for the width and 30 or 2 times 15 for the height. Now comes the step that seems to always take the longest in classes, and that is matching the decorative paper with the spine covering material. The size of the decorative paper will vary from kit to kit. It really depends on the original size of the source sheets of paper that I'm using. These sheets are larger than necessary, but there was no point trimming them down. I would have just put the waste in the bin, so I thought it was better that you got the excess pieces so that you can use them in other projects. So we'll just cut 2 pieces to the size that we determined a moment ago. Now it's time to cover the book. So we'll glue out the decorative paper using the PVA. Now when you glue out paper, you sort of try and glue from the center out. So you sort of work radially. So get a nice even layer of adhesive on the whole piece of paper. And then pitch that to the book. So you want to pitch it to the 2 little prick marks on the cloth, eyeballing that the head and tail are even. Roll the paper down onto the book and smooth it down with your hand, And then using your scissors, trim the corners so that they're 3 millimeters away from the corner and roughly 45 degrees. It doesn't be exact, doesn't need to be exact. And then we turn in the head and tail first. We always turn in head and tail, then foredge. Now there's going to be a little piece of paper that overhangs the corner, and you poke that down onto the edge of the board. So I'm just using the bone folder to push that down against the edge of the board. Now the foredge turn-in will have got a bit dry, so I just freshen that up, then use the bone folder to lift that up and turn it over. Just tidy up the corners. When you trim the corner, if it was more than 3 millimeters, there may be a little bit of paper that's sticking up, and you can just use a small pair of scissors to trim that off. And then it's just a matter of doing the other side of the book and completing the other 3 books as well. Now, for the corners, some people like to measure that really accurately and use the set square to cut exactly 45 degrees. However, because we have glued out the complete sheet of paper, because it's quite small, it's sort of hard to measure that without getting everything covered in glue. And it really isn't necessary. It's one of the steps in bookbinding where a bit of speed actually produces a better result than trying to get it exact. So we're almost done. The final step is called pasting down the end paper. So the two coloured sheets are the end papers, and the outermost ones will get pasted down to the boards. So we'll get a piece of waste to protect the other pages and put it down underneath the outermost page, and then we'll paste it out and then lower the board down onto it. It's a good idea to check that there's no wrinkles in the paste down, and that's best done on the edge of your bench. Put the spine so that it overhangs the edge of the bench, and then use your hand or a bone folder to smooth out any wrinkles. And once you do the second page, then it's a matter of standing the book up open to let the glue to dry, and then the book is done. That's the end of the project. I hope you have 4 wonderful handmade books now to either use yourself or give to family and friends as presents. If you have any problems with the kits or making the kits, please let me know straight away and I'll help you fix the problem. My contact details are in the instruction book that comes with the kit and hopefully are in the description of this video. Thanks again for buying the kit and completing the project. I hope you've enjoyed it and it's helped you on your bookbinding journey. Keep an eye on my store for new kits. And until next time, cheerio.